Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today as CSBA's Education Legal Alliance presents the justifications for our decision to file a lawsuit against the state of California in defense of the state constitution, in defense of Proposition 98 and the sanctity and stability of our education funding model, and in defense of the resources that our California public school students need for success. This is not a step that we take lightly, but Proposition 98 is central to our work, and it was important to take action now as a matter of principle and as a matter of law. We'll go in depth to explain the history that led to this decision, the legal justification for it, and the importance of Prop 98 to public schools as we know them in our state. But before we get to all that information, we're going to take care of a few housekeeping details to help you participate in the webinar. If you would advance the slide, please. So we will disregard the slide, but just moving ahead, if you want to file a question, please submit it using the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. We will reserve time for questions at the end of the presentations. This whole presentation should be concluded in less than 1 hour, but just use those Q&A icons to submit your questions, and we will get to them in short order. And before we go into the heart of the presentation, I would like to introduce some of today's speakers. We have with us CSBA President Albert Gonzalez, CSBA CEO and Executive Director Vernon M. Billy, CSBA General Counsel Kristen Lindgren Brazzoni, CSBA Chief Governmental Relations Officer Patrick O'Donnell, CSBA Legislative Director Christopher Reef, and then we also have external experts for the legal opinions. We are joined by Dennis Wolliver, Kelly shareholder and Chair of the Board Ethics, Transparency, and Accountability and Litigation Practice Groups, William Tunick of DWK. And for budgetary expertise, we have on hand Senior Policy and Fiscal Advisor for Children Now and former K-12 Education Director of the California Legislative Analyst's Office, Rob Manwaring. So with no further ado, I will turn it over to our CSBA president as the top leader of CSBA's membership to explain why this issue is so critical to local school districts and county offices of education. Albert.
Thank you, Troy. In the 16 years that I've been on the board, Prop 98 has been instrumental in making sure that we have the resources that we need. And obviously, sometimes those resources, we need more than Prop 98 can deliver, but definitely that's something that has been a tool that we've been able to use to implement much of the educational opportunities that we needed for our students. So in an effort to defend the state constitution, protect vital resources needed for California students, preserve the integrity of the state school funding system, and really to respect the will of the voters, the California School Boards Association Education Legal Alliance is suing the state of California for its failure to comply with Proposition 98, the voter-approved school funding law. Throughout the 2024 education budget process, the California Department of Finance, Governor Gavin Newsom, and the state legislature repeatedly introduced or retained budget provisions containing both the letter and intent of Proposition 98. Despite consistent objections from CSBA, the adopted 2024 Education Omnibus Budget Trailer Bill contains a provision that undermines Proposition 98 constitutional provisions and sets a precedent for funding school districts, county offices of education, and community colleges below the constitutionally mandated minimum funding guarantee. Specifically, Education Code Section 41206.04 directs the state in years following delayed tax collections to alter the calculation of the minimum funding level under Proposition 98 by excluding funds previously allocated to TK through 14 public schools for the calculation. This is unlawful, and the provision has the effect of artificially lowering baseline upon which future year schools funding is established, thereby diminishing education funding indefinitely. The subversion of Proposition 98 began with the governor's January budget proposal, intensified with the May revise, and was later basically moved forward as far as it was scaled back a little bit, subsequent versions of the budget, but yet even this manipulation still remains and is unacceptable as it removes a funding safety net that has served schools for more than 3 decades and could be used by future governors and legislators to avoid complying with the Proposition 98 funding guarantee. More severe financial circumstances than the one California is currently facing were resolved by undoing this proposition in law without resorting to unconstitutional measures. So we've done it in the past. We could have did it better this year as well. So it was CSBA's hope that the current budget scenario would be addressed in a similar fashion, but without the need for litigation. But the state's refusal to abandon the Proposition 98 manipulation left no recourse but a lawsuit. The state has tried to rationalize the diversion from the law by specifying that it would only take place indirectly when delayed tax collections occur, as it did during the 23-24 fiscal year. But the state cannot guarantee this. And even if it could, the presumed rarity of an unconstitutional act would not excuse it. In addition, this statute potentially opens the door for further manipulation of Prop 98 minimum guarantee in the future and circumstances. So CSBA is definitely opposed to this manipulation and is defending the voter-approved Prop 98, which is non-negotiable, as this is the obligation of the state to follow the Constitution that governs it. CSBA believes the court will find, as we do, that the provision of the state's education budget trailer bill defies the express will of the voters, violates the California Constitution, destroys the common practice of funding public schools, and subjects students to unacceptable risk in the form of diminished resources of support for academic achievement and well-being. And that is why CSBA has taken this measure to file this lawsuit. And with that, I want to bring in our CEO, Executive Director, Vernon Billy.
Thank you, Albert. First, I want to be clear. Our lawsuit is not intended to blow up the whole education budget. We are focused on one issue in a 200+ page budget that opens the door for further manipulation of Proposition 98. Now, I kind of want to reiterate some of the things that Albert said, but more importantly, I think the focus outside of that, we're not trying to blow up the entire budget, is that the voters intended for Prop 98 to provide an objectively determined minimum level of education spending each year that would essentially insulate schools from arbitrary manipulation. Because Prop 98 relies on these formulas to set the minimum guarantee, warping the calculation of those formulas, which we believe that's what the state has done, so that it can avoid school funding obligations, we believe it violates the Constitution and violates Prop 98. This effort, this death by 1,000 cuts, is a dangerous strategy that continues to undermine the voters' will in Prop 98. CSBA's focus now and what will continue to be in the future is to ensure the integrity of Prop 98 and that it's maintained and that schools of the state receive the resources they were guaranteed by this initiative. And with that, I will turn it over to Rob to talk a little bit more in depth about Proposition 98. Rob?
Thanks, Vernon. So Proposition 98, and then amended by Proposition 111 around 1990, has been in place for quite a while. I've been working on it since the late 90s, and it always surprises you. And this is yet another surprise in that history. So it's a constitutional minimum guarantee for K-12 schools and community colleges. And it consists of 3 main formulas that are often referred to as tests, test 1, 2, and 3. 2 of those main formulas, test 2 and 3, they start off with looking at what did you spend last year, and we're going to adjust what you spent last year for growth in the economy and growth in student attendance. And that's what you're going to be required to spend this year. So that's where this particular provision that's being proposed, that is part of the budget trailer bill for this year, would impact potential future Prop 98 calculations. What the specific language would require, and it actually required, it's not even an option, it would require the Director of Finance to take a specific action if the tax deadline was delayed from April 15th by at least 2 weeks. So in the case of that delay, and this happened just recently because of major flooding in the state, there was a delay, but it could happen in the future, both flooding, fires, other natural disasters, or pandemic, or other reasons. So it is a prospective look at the situation. If that trigger happens and we've delayed by 2 months, what the Director of Finance would have to do is he would have to exclude from that prior year calculation. So again, prior year, we build off of that and grow from there. It would take away from that prior year amount any spending above the minimum guarantee for that year. If this had been in place in January under the proposal that the governor put forward in January that Patrick O'Donnell will be going into in just a minute, it would have been like an $8 billion impact on the minimum guarantee calculation. So while it is this one small provision in a 250-page trailer bill, it could have quite a substantial impact on future budgets. So what would happen under this language would be, it would say, ignore the Constitution and instead exclude some of the spending in the prior year on schools from the calculation. And by excluding it from the prior year, it then reduces the amount that would be owed in that particular budget year. And this could be in the billions of dollars. And so since the Constitution is pretty clear, look at what you spent on schools last year and adjust it for growth in the economy, we don't see how it can be constitutional to say, yeah, but exclude this portion of the spending in the prior year. So we believe that the strength of the Constitution will prevail in this case, and allow a court to see that, yes, indeed, you have to count all of the money that was spent in the prior year and aren't able to exclude this without a constitutional change. So that's the main issue that's at play here. I'm going to hand it over to Patrick O'Donnell, who will go into the details of what happened this last budget season and how this particular action relates to that experience. Patrick.
Thank you, Rob. And very simply put, the governor in his January proposal put in some language in the budget, words that we find to be unconstitutional. We're not, again, fighting the entire budget. What we are fighting and pushing back against, because we believe it is unconstitutional, is a specific subsection in the adopted budget. Okay, and understand, please, that advocating to protect Proposition 98 and any threat to Proposition 98 is central to the mission of CSBA, our school board members, and of course, our CSBA governmental relations team. If anyone attempts to manipulate Proposition 98, I can assure you CSBA will activate. You manipulate, we will activate. And last January, we did just that. So this isn't something new that we've been talking about, It's something we've been talking about since the original proposal came out last January 10th. Okay. Our legislative efforts and engagement this year reflect our approach to vehemently protecting Proposition 98, and we do not apologize for protecting Proposition 98. It is central to the mission of our school board members in the state of California. When the governor first announced the budget maneuver in his January budget proposal, we immediately communicated to the governor's office and the legislature in writing of our belief that the budget maneuver under consideration was and remains unconstitutional. Through individual meetings and written communications, our membership and GR team advocated our position to legislators across the state. We had many meetings with legislators, some in person, many virtual, also a lot of written communication from our GR team, and our members went out to the legislature. By April, it became clear that our CSBA advocacy served to educate legislators as to the unconstitutional nature of the proposed budget maneuver. Many legislators shared that they too now had concerns about the budget maneuver. Okay. Still, the budget maneuver showed up in the May revise. CSBA again went to work, engaging the legislature and the governor's office via written communications and direct advocacy to remove the unconstitutional budget language. Okay. Clearly, our advocacy worked to some extent. It had some impact because the budget maneuver language was altered after the May revise in the trailer bill that was ultimately adopted by the legislature and signed by the governor. It was much more, I guess, it was much more limited than it originally had been. Still unconstitutional from our perspective, but the more tailored language than had been originally contemplated than in the original budget. Again, the language adopted in the final trailer bill was a bit more tailored, but remained unconstitutional. That's why we're having this conversation today. So as you can see, CSBA starting in January had many communications with the executive branch, the legislative branch, as to the unconstitutionality of this proposal, which was ultimately adopted. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris Reeve, our legislative director.
Thanks, Patrick. Appreciate it. Much like Rob had reviewed and to Patrick's what Patrick shared, our membership really took great seriousness in what the governor was proposing in January, and helping to inform the legislature as well as the administration of our deep concerns and opposition to the maneuver. And you saw this not just in terms of our reaction in January, but also in terms of the work that our membership had done during March when we held our legislative action week, where hundreds of school board members descended on the state capitol to advocate against the maneuver. And then, of course, when the governor doubled down on the maneuver during the May revise, we also elevated that advocacy. Many of the concerns that the membership have, as well as here at CSBA, was that the precedent-setting nature of the maneuver. And we'll get more into that with Kristen and William here shortly. But the long history here is that through our advocacy and helping raise that level of awareness about the dangers of the maneuver, we're really exhausted. Many efforts were made to try to get the maneuver out of the budget and out of the resulting budget trailer bill, but to no avail. And so really, there was not much of an opportunity left other than to pursue legal action. And so with that legal action, I'll transition over to Kristen Lincoln-Brazzoni and William Tunick.
Thank you, Chris. So the ELA, the Education Legal Alliance, which is part of CSBA, has a long and storied history of protecting Prop 98. This is just another instance. This isn't a one-time thing. It's a constant battle that we are fighting as economic conditions change and the state has pressure on its budget and is looking for creative ways to address that. This provision, as Rob noted, was somewhat buried in a trailer bill, but it didn't escape our notice because we find that one of our main tenets of what we do is protecting Prop 98. So getting down sort of to brass tacks, on Monday, CSBA and its ELA filed a writ of mandate and complaint for declaratory relief in Sacramento Superior Court, seeking to invalidate the statute that we've referenced, Education Code Section 41206.04 and Subdivision D. So this is a very narrow lawsuit on a very narrow piece of law, but it has the opportunity for expansion, and that's one of the reasons that we took this action. And we think this is a pretty straightforward argument that will be successful. Prop 98, as you know, is a constitutional provision, and this statute effectively seeks to amend Prop 98 without actually amending the Constitution. And Rob did a really good job of explaining what this provision will do, so I won't belabor the point, but William will go into more detail about the specific allegations in the writ and complaint for declaratory relief. While this might seem, as I noted, to be a very narrow issue, seeking to invalidate a statute that would be triggered only by a certain set of circumstances, we view this as an encroachment on Prop 98 that we take seriously. We believe in maintaining the integrity of Prop 98, and any unconstitutional encroachment on that is something that we will take on. But also the potential to challenge it will potentially embolden the state to continue to make these sort of incremental changes that maybe don't seem that problematic because they're limited to certain circumstances, et cetera, but continually chip away at Prop 98. And that's where we see ourselves as the bulwark against that kind of unconstitutional change. As Rob noted, if Prop 98 needs to be changed, then it needs to go back to the voters because they're the ones who set this in place, and their intent is what is important, and that's what we're protecting. So I'll turn it over to William for some more detail.
Thanks, Kristen. So just to build on what Kristen said, the Proposition 98 guarantee is a constitutional, not an education code or statutory requirement. And because it's in the state constitution, the legislature cannot adopt a law or a statute which changes its requirement. Under Proposition 98, the Constitution does not include a specific amount of funding. Instead, what it does, the voters enacted, I should say, detailed language in the Constitution that requires the state to calculate the guarantee in a particular manner. That constitutional language includes the two tests or the formula that Rob mentioned previously, which require the guarantee to be calculated based on the total amount allocated to school districts in the prior year. And again, because this is constitutional language, it cannot be changed or modified without a vote of the electorate. But as you've heard, what the state did here was to adopt a statute which attempts to change the terms of that constitutional formulas, not for the most recent budget, but for future years, to require that the calculation be based only on some, but not the total amount of allocations from the prior year. And again, because the formula is part of the Constitution and the formula requires the calculation to be based on the total amount of allocations, the state cannot adopt a statute which alters that formula to only count some of the allocations. They would have needed to get voter approval for that, and because they didn't, the change is unconstitutional. And so as Kristen mentioned, because of this, CSBA is specifically asking the court to declare the new statutory provision unconstitutional and prevent the state from using it in future years to deviate from the constitutionally required formula. That lawsuit, as mentioned, was filed in Sacramento Superior Court, and while we do not have a court date at this time, we would anticipate a hearing on the matter will take place in the upcoming months. And with that, I'd like to hand it back off to Troy.
Thank you, William. Thank you, Kristen. And thank you to all of our presenters for really illustrating how what can be a very technical issue has significant and real consequences for the integrity of our school funding model, and most importantly, for the resources that our students need. So I don't see any questions in the chat, but I'd like to just pitch a couple questions to our panelists to highlight some of the trickier issues here. And I just want to be very clear about what CSBA's objective is here. So if Kristen or William, if you just want to reiterate what we are looking for from the courts in terms of relief, so there's no misunderstanding on that issue.
Yeah, I'll hand this over to you, William, to just kind of lay out what our request for relief is. You did
Sure.
a little bit, but maybe go into a little bit more detail.
Yeah, happy to do that. So the complaint itself or the petition that's filed with the court really asks the court to do two things. First, it's to declare that the specific provision of the statute that we're concerned with is unconstitutional. That's subdivision D of Education Code section 41206.04. So it's that specific subdivision, which is the one that talks about how this calculation would be done in future years if there were tax deferred filings. That is the target of the lawsuit. It asks the court to declare that that is unconstitutional, given what you've heard today. And then the second cause of action in the lawsuit is for a court order, essentially, to the director of the Department of Finance, directing that official and the department to calculate Prop 98 calculation in the future pursuant to the Constitution, and essentially not to follow the unconstitutional direction from that statute subdivision D of 41206.04. And so those are the two pieces of relief that we're asking the court to grant in this case.
Great. Thank you for specifying that. Another question which has come up in the early returns since we filed this lawsuit has been this idea that because this particular provision only applies in years when there are delayed tax submissions, a delayed tax filing deadline, that it's not that big of a deal, and maybe we're making too much out of nothing. So if we could just revisit why this is an absolute principle and why, even though it's not a given, even the potential of undermining Prop 98 is an unacceptable threat to school funding and to students. If someone would like to respond to that.
I can. I tried to lay it out a little bit in my opening remarks. I think, initially unconstitutional is unconstitutional. And we take seriously the integrity of Prop 98, and it needs to remain the way that the voters voted for it, and then amended it with Prop 111. So that's item one, and we're always going to look to do that, even when it feels like a narrow issue. And number two, it's like I said, we want to watch for any doors being open to allow further manipulation of Prop 98. It might be fine to say, oh, well, this one is so narrow that we're going to let it go. But we want to be clear and have a court weigh in that, in fact, despite the fact that there is, a limited circumstance here, it's still not within the confines of Prop 98. And the legislature does not have the authority to create statutes that are outside of the constitutional language. They may create implementing statutes that help implement the language, but if it conflicts with the language, then it's unconstitutional. And so we want to make sure that we aren't allowing any kind of doors to be open for further manipulation, and allow that to be chipped away.
And Troy, I just want to piggyback off what Kristen said on kind of a different issue, but it's also a funding issue. This takes me back to the reserve issue that we fought a number of years ago. And everyone was saying, oh, it's such a narrow issue. Oh, it'll never be triggered. Why are you guys, why is CSBA opposed to this? Why is CSBA fighting this? And similar to this, it was about the ability of our members to be able to receive the resources that they needed to operate their schools. And in fact, that trigger was pulled and has been pulled. So we were right back then. And I believe, and what we're saying today is we believe that we're going to be right on this as well. And protecting 98 is critically important because you don't know what the future holds. And if we continue to allow the state to open that door of manipulation, as I said in my statement, it's a death by 1,000 cuts as it relates to the integrity of Prop 98. And that's what we want to avoid.
Another issue I think that's worth addressing is that we're in a different period these last couple years with regard to the state budget than we were the previous 8 or 9 years, where we enjoyed some unusually robust tax returns. And as a result, schools benefited from a revenue perspective. But now for the first time in quite a while, we're entering a period where revenues are going to be constrained for at least a few years. And so the temptation to infringe upon Prop 98 and to play games with Prop 98 is greater than it's been in quite a while. So maybe Robert, if you could speak to the danger that we're entering now and why we can't be complacent, because there are different incentives to manipulate Prop 98 than we've had in recent years.
Sure. I mean, there have been several attempts all the way back to the start of Proposition 98 to do things that were questionable constitutionally, and then courts have found, in fact, were unconstitutional. These have come from example, and they've all come in bad fiscal years, right? And we're not saying that next year will be a bad fiscal year or the year after that, but that we know that they're coming at some point in time. We will hit some rough fiscal times, and the legislature and the governor will have to make difficult choices. And in the past, it's been things like borrowing from future Prop 98 years to pay this year's costs, and then shortening how much would be available in future years. And that was found to be unconstitutional. Been a lot of arguments around which programs are in Proposition 98, which ones aren't. And if you move a program in or out, how do you adjust the guarantee to maintain the integrity of it? This has happened a lot around childcare and state preschool programs moving in and out of that divide. There have been several lawsuits around that, including some from CSBA. And indeed, time and again, the courts have supported the minimum guarantee and its calculations and its fundamental integrity. And this just seems like another example of that. maybe this trigger doesn't get pulled for a couple of years, but 10 years down the road, which, when I started this back in the 90s, I didn't think I'd be doing this 25 plus years later. But, these things pop up and you go through these cyclical cycles in the state budget as the state economy changes. And then, the legislature decide, or the governor decide, like, we have to do something with this Prop 98 thing. There is relief. It's called a suspension of the guarantee. That is the tool that is in the Constitution that can be used, and actually was used in this last budget as the alternative. And in fact, was the largest suspension the state has ever had. But we don't want to deviate the meaning of the Constitution to allow something to happen, and that's what I think CSBA is trying to take on here.
Thank you, Robert. We have a question from Blake Jones of Politico. I think this one is for Kristen. Blake is asking whether CSBA asked other education groups to join the lawsuit or to make filings in the case.
So the short answer is no, we did not. Our practice at the ELA is typically not to have other plaintiffs in the case and to just handle them on our own. That has been our longstanding practice, and for various reasons. I think CSBA was a little bit kind of out on its own a little bit on this issue from the get-go as well. So we feel like we're the best ones to take this forward. And if anyone else wants to comment on that, I'm happy to hear that as well.
I will quickly, if that's okay, Troy. Yeah, listen, you're right that CSBA is a little bit out on their own on this, but mostly we've been in front. We were the organization that came out early in January and said, wait a minute, this is unconstitutional. We do not support this. Now, some other organizations came along, we're appreciative of that. But this organization was the one that came out very strongly and came out first, because we are the ones that we are purists when it comes to Proposition 98. We are going to protect Proposition 98. And quite frankly, politically, it would have been much easier for us to just sit back and say, well, we'll let this one go. But again, as been alluded to by some of the prior speakers, if you let this go, well, what happens next time, right? It's just a sentence or two this time. Well, it's a paragraph that they add next time. So we need to be very cautious about any attempt to further manipulate the meaning or the numbers in Proposition 98.
Those are all very good answers. And I would just add that the CSBA's Education Alliance is not just CSBA staff here in Sacramento. This is a consortium, a group of members who have come together to invest in a robust advocacy and legal defense of issues of widespread significance to school districts and county offices of education across the state. So it's CSBA's legal alliance, but really it's the state of California in terms of school districts and CEOs from top to bottom of the state that are coming together because this issue is so important. And one of our members has a question about what is Newsom's or Bonta's argument in opposition to our lawsuit. I don't know if we want to make their case for them, but perhaps we could provide just a sketch of what their position is.
I would actually say, I mean, since we just filed the lawsuit on Monday, we wouldn't have heard back from them yet. So, we don't really want to get into the weeds of what they might or might not say. William, if you want to weigh in on maybe kind of what you think the argument might be, but I think we've tried to anticipate those arguments and what we've said today around, kind of the idea that this is sort of a minimal encroachment with specific circumstances triggering it. But for the most part, we're going to let them weigh in the litigation as they have the right to do.
Yeah, as Kristen said, we obviously don't know at this point. The primary argument we're making is it's unconstitutional. I assume the response will be that it is constitutional, and it may very well be, as Kristen mentioned, that maybe this won't happen. It's a small encroachment, whatever kind of variation on that argument there may be. But I think, as we've said several times, unconstitutional is unconstitutional. It doesn't matter if it's maybe in 10 years or if it maybe is once in the next 50 years, it's still leaving that door open, allowing a statute to change what the Constitution says is something that I think we can't stand by and allow Prop 98 to be sort of have the erosion at the edges like that, because eventually it will continue to encroach. So we'll see what they say. But again, I think our argument is going to be pretty straightforward that, you know, the Constitution says what it says.
All right, thank you. And we have a question from John Fensterwald of EdSource. I think this one is best suited for either Rob or William. John says that revenue calculations change over time. What are the Prop 98 restrictions on adjusting the base level? The legislature can only adjust up, not down. That's a question. And he also says, won't future governors' response, if you win the case, be to lowball projections when setting the budget in June and adjust upward months or years later?
So first on the first thing, certainly revenue estimates change dramatically over the course of the year. And it's often, you know, so for example, in the current year, the 24-25 fiscal year, when we get to May of 25 and actually know what our revenues are for the 24-25 fiscal year, we fully expect that the governor will make adjustments to the spending plan for the state. That often has led to things like, on the upside, dramatic new programs. Things like community schools, expanded learning happened when there were those one-time upward adjustments. On the downside, we've often seen things that are hard for schools to handle, things like funding deferrals, which is paying schools in July for expenses that they incurred in the prior fiscal year that ended in June. Those things have happened in the past. So the legislature does have the ability to adjust upward and downward. And in fact, we saw this in the last budget that was just adopted this summer. There were both deferrals, moving money to pay for last year's expenses in the next fiscal year. That we saw that in this last budget. And we saw the governor actually, you know, reduce spending and shift the spending appropriations across years. Obviously, as an education advocate, we like to see those upward adjustments and aren't as keen on the downward ones, but that's just part of the, you know, the constitutional guarantee. Will the governor lowball projections? Because there are tools to adjust upward and downward, you know, certainly some governors have been more conservative than others. Governor Brown was probably more conservative in his fiscal estimates than others were. And it tended to lead to a lot of one-time monies being available to settle up a fiscal year than others. Governor Newsom has been perhaps a little bit closer to actual projections. You know, but you see that in the budget discussions as it goes to the legislature. And the Legislative Analyst Office will also weigh in and give the legislature a different look at what that fiscal forecast looks like. And then through the budget negotiations, they determine which of those revenues to use and whether to make any adjustments in their assumptions.
Great. I think that's a thorough response. Not seeing any further questions. One person has their hand raised, but we answered their question in the chat. So I believe we've done our duty there. I would encourage people, if they want to consult or review some of the documents that we've been using to make our case, to visit the budget resources page on the CSBA website. If you Google CSBA budget resources, that will be the top link in the search results. Or if you go to the CSBA homepage under governance and policy resources, there's a specific menu item called budget resources, and you will have our statement to the press on this issue of the Prop 98 lawsuit, as well as a longer explanation for the technical reasons and the justification for our position. And then also some more background on the budget going all the way back through November 2023 to the current date. And that's always a good site to consult for information about education budget issues, even outside of major developments like this current lawsuit. Naturally, we will keep you informed of any developments as it moves through the court and keep you updated on developments for next year's budget. There's always some contentious issues, but CSBA is always advocating for our public schools, our school district, county offices of education, and the students you serve. So thank you for tuning in. We'll be in touch soon. Take care and goodbye.